Now, as the nation honors the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the president and vice president are calling on Congress to pass voting rights legislation. Right now, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act both lie in the hands of the Senate, but with opposition from Republicans, the bills are unlikely to move ahead unless Democrats can change the Senate filibuster. CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes brings us the latest on this.
In Washington today, the family of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. marched in favor of voting reform.
We're tired of being patient.
The president and vice president sounded the alarm as well.
Our freedom to vote is under assault.
The attack on our democracy is real.
And yet a major voting reform bill is poised to fail in the Senate as soon as tomorrow, which has advocates turning up the heat on two Senate Democrats.
History will not remember them kindly.
Arizona's Kyrsten Sinema and West Virginia's Joe Manchin both say they support voting reform, but they don't back a rule change that would enable Democrats to pass that reform bill without Republican support.
I never got a call on that from the White House.
One Republican, Utah Senator Mitt Romney, said he'd be open to negotiation, but he doesn't support the proposed legislation, which would allow early voting and vote by mail in all 50 states and make Election Day a national holiday. Over the past year, 19 states have passed more restrictive voting laws.
Voting discrimination is alive and well.
Kristen Clark is the first African-American woman to head the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division.
There is no doubt that we are seeing efforts to make it harder for people of color and other marginalized groups to vote.
According to a new CBS poll, more than 4 in 10 Americans think President Biden is not focusing enough on voting rights and race relations. But his predecessor continues to push for more restrictions, especially in states he lost in 2020.
Their legislation is not a voting rights bill. It's a voting fraud bill.
And Nancy Cordes joins us now from outside the chilly White House this evening. Nancy, we know the Senate will take up these two voting rights bills when lawmakers reconvene on Tuesday, and we've seen President Biden physically engage with Senate Democrats just last week on Capitol Hill. But is he expected to further push for this in the day ahead, considering what's at stake?
Absolutely, if only because he's got activists and Democrats who very much want to see this legislation pass, and he feels the same way. He knows that the odds are stacked against him. He knows that these two Senate holdouts, Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, are dug in. They say they're not going to change their minds, but he really doesn't have any other options at this point. So he'll continue to make the case privately to them. He'll continue to make the case to the country that this voting legislation is badly needed. But if and when that legislation does fail in the Senate because it does not have any Republican support, then there's really an open question about where Democrats can go from there. It appears that any type of legislation is most likely to be stalled in the Senate. So what else can the president do? He's already issued some executive orders. It's possible, I suppose, that he could ask the Department of Justice to do more to combat voter suppression. But beyond that, his hands appear to be tied right now.
I want to turn now to some of our newest poll numbers on the president's handling of the pandemic overall. This was fresh this weekend. Just over 1/3 of Americans believe attempts to contain the coronavirus are going well, and a growing number of Americans say the information from health officials is becoming confusing, likely pointing toward mask and quarantine guidelines, which have changed. You know, how closely is the Biden administration recognizing this sentiment, and might there be a plan to alleviate some of these frustrations across the country over what seems to be a disjointed message?
Look, I think they're well aware that so many Americans are concerned about coronavirus itself, about all the effects that it has had on the economy, on inflation, on education, on the supply chain, and on and on. Our lives have been touched by it in so many ways. So they're well aware that Americans' opinions about how this White House and the administration more broadly are handling coronavirus, of course, is going to reflect on the president's approval ratings and how well his party does in the upcoming running elections. They say that they strive to be clear, but they're dealing with an evolving virus, which requires changing rules. And they have acknowledged at times that some of these rule changes have been a little confusing, that some of the CDC guidance perhaps hasn't been quite as well explained as it could have been. The challenge, they say, is that guidance that they provide 1 week may not necessarily hold the next week. And they're also dealing with situations they've never been through before. So they're kind of making it up on the fly based on the latest research, based on what people are experiencing. And it isn't always a smooth process.
Just remarkable. And speaking of just how fast this variant of COVID has been spreading, hitting all aspects of our lives and the economy, Joint Chiefs Chairman General Mark Milley says he's experiencing minor symptoms after testing positive for the virus on Sunday, and we know that he was last with President Biden January 12th. That's last week, Wednesday. Is the president undergoing any additional testing as a result of that?
You know, the White House doesn't keep us abreast of his day-to-day testing. All they will usually tell us is that he gets tested very frequently, almost on a daily basis. He is typically masked when he's in meetings here at the White House. He is, of course, vaccinated and boosted. And if he were to test negative, all of our assumptions are positive, rather. All of our assumptions are that we would be informed. But as of right now, he was out and about today and over the weekend, and so far no signs that he himself has contracted the virus.
And Nancy, before we let you go, President Biden is expected to hold his first news conference of the year this week. It will mark his first full year in office. I think we, based on this conversation, know what to expect will be brought up. But what do we expect the administration's messaging to be?
I think what they're going to argue, what the president will argue, at least in that press conference, is that he is trying to do big things, and that when you try to do big things, whether it's tackling COVID, whether it's passing major voting rights legislation, whether it is passing a $2 trillion social spending bill, that there are going to be bumps in the road, that you're not always going to be successful. This is the message I think you're likely to hear from this president on Wednesday, because, frankly, he knows that there are people in his own party who are disappointed, and our own polling reflects it, that there are people who wish that he had pushed harder on many of these issues. But what he is going to argue is that it's only year one and that he has time, and if he isn't successful right off the bat, in some cases, that he is going to keep trying. I think that is the message you're likely to hear from him in this rare press conference.
Well, we will certainly tune in. Nancy Cordes, thank you very much.
You're welcome.